While the very idea of something being a guilty pleasure is kinda silly, I find it hard to describe my enjoyment of games that consciously style themselves as interactive movies in any other way. From a more discerning perspective, they are superficial, often pretentiously aloof games that seem to have very little faith in their own medium's ability to tell meaningful stories without falling back on the techniques and style of cinema. Yet, I can't deny that there's something about these dumb, inherently goofy games that draw me in. These are games that boil down their mechanical interactions to such a finite degree that to call them games often feels like a stretch. The interaction comes from allowing the player to make decisions on behalf of the characters, a choose your own adventure story fully animated, though given the raw cost of producing the amount of content several branching paths demands, the actual influence the player wields is often limited or illusory. The result is a story that, while novel for its interactivity, more often than not fails to cohere all that satisfyingly. The player's role in shaping the story either irrelevant or perhaps too relevant for the story's own good, the organic flow of the narrative disrupted by the player's whim. The first of these games I can remember getting into was Quantic Dream's Heavy Rain, a game whose desire to be like a movie is only matched by its desire to be gritty and dour. How else to obtain the same prestige as film, right? Jokes aside, I adored Heavy Rain when I was younger for its self seriousness and for the novelty of its choice driven narrative, and even now I still have affection for it, but it's far from a sincere, artful affection, though it's not a so bad it's good kind of thing either. Truth be told, I unironically enjoy playing these games, in spite of their obvious shortcomings and seeming lack of faith in the merits of their own medium. I don't have some profound argument for why, and let's be honest, at least in the case of David Cage's work, there's not much profundity to grasp at. I guess there's just something endearing to me in how they make a story playable through as simple a mechanical framework as, essentially, QuickTime events. What I especially enjoyed about Heavy Rain was how failure and death weren't treated as obstacles the player needed to overcome in order to progress, but as failures that defined your progression through the story. Ethan Mars fails an escape sequence and gets caught by the police. Guess you're gonna have to deal with that if you want to keep searching for your son. Slip up and get Norman Jaded killed in a fight halfway through the game? Well, he's gone. Hopefully someone else can solve the mystery of the origami killer. QuickTime events are hardly an inventive form of gameplay, but when one or two missed prompts can completely change the course of the story and lead to the permanent death of a player character, I find they can still be engaging. I think the folks at Supermassive Games must have seen this too, as their 2015 hit Until Dawn borrowed heavily from the framework of games like Heavy Rain to tell a story based almost entirely around how the player's actions determine whether its various characters survive or die, and what better genre to emulate in that effort than the horror genre. Until Dawn was a blatant, joyous horror pastiche, willing to throw every trope and cheap scare it could muster into its story of high school nimrods getting way in over their heads on an ill-conceived mountain getaway. The cast faced crazed maniacs, prowling monsters, and enough toxic teen drama to fuel an 80s slasher franchise, and the result was an absolute crowd pleaser. It's not that Until Dawn did all that much to elevate the Heavy Rain formula, so much as it found, in emulating horror movies, the perfect vehicle for said formula. One that catered to its emphasis on choice and consequence and mitigated the shortcomings of its silliness by embracing the silliness of its influences. It wasn't even a bad story either, it just knew better than to take itself as seriously as something like Heavy Rain, and that made liking it a whole lot easier. Clearly recognizing what a waste it would be not to milk this successful recipe for all it's worth, Supermassive has attempted to capture that same magic with their latest batch of games, collectively titled the Dark Pictures Anthology. These games are shorter and less maximalist in their approach to imitating horror movies than Until Dawn, tending to focus on particular horror aesthetics and tropes. While the collective efforts of the Dark Pictures games so far are less experimental with the established framework than I would like, attempts at cooperative play aside, they continue to hit the same nail on the head with the compulsively engaging horror storytelling that made Until Dawn so much fun. Whether or not that is still enough is a fair question, and I wouldn't hold it against anyone who feels like the formula's grown a bit stale. Me though, I still have a ton of fun with these games, so I thought it'd be interesting to go through the anthology game by game and talk about what each accomplishes and how they might be falling short. While the games all feel the same to play on a fundamental level, the priorities of approach in each are quite different, feeling out the strengths and weaknesses of this cinematic system's utility. I feel the need to say before getting into the nitty gritty of it all that I thoroughly enjoyed my time with each of these games, even if some of what I have to say may suggest otherwise. Like I said, I tend to enjoy these kinds of games despite the obvious problems they have, but that doesn't mean I'm not going to pick them apart for the sake of it. Spoilers ahead for all three of the Dark Pictures games so far, so assuming you're cool with that, let's get started. The first of the Dark Pictures, Medan, is inspired by an urban legend regarding a ship of the same name going missing under mysterious circumstances. Its entire crew supposedly found dead, but with no evidence as to how or why. It's the kind of classic, nautical horror setup that feels comfortably in the wheelhouse of Until Dawn's pastiche sensibilities, the game, overall, being an enjoyable, if somewhat restrained horror experience. We begin with a pair of drunk American soldiers stationed in China in 1947, who ship the Medan, depart shortly after the two are thrown into the brig for their insobriety. Sometime later, after sobering up, they find the ship has been assailed by some unseen force that has left most of the crew dead from sheer terror, and it doesn't take long for that same force to prey upon these last holdouts as well. The abruptness with which the prologue ends makes it all the more effective, depriving the player and its protagonists of any context before they succumb to horrific deaths, never even sure what killed them. All of the Dark Pictures prologues work this way, establishing characters and setting only long enough for those characters to be abruptly killed and for the setting to be rendered thoroughly haunted by the act, and thus we are introduced to the anthology's central unifying theme, death. If this weren't clear enough, the game's opening credits hammered the point home with its doom metal rendition of the same opening song from Until Dawn, a folk-inspired plea with death personified. Appropriately, the sequence follows the Curator, a figure who, less and less subtly as the series goes on, embodies death and acts as a sort of host, framing each story as an incomplete tale guided by the unnamed influence of the player. Each of the games has roughly the same opening sequence, the Curator bursting through those doors and marching down a hall of miscellaneous macabre images, smugly looking into the camera as the music blares angstily. It's loud and corny and never fails to get me pumped for the game ahead, as it shows that Supermassive, above all else, are still just having fun dabbling in the overtly grim for the sake of it, and that you'll have the best time by getting on that level too. Death may seem a somewhat banal and twining theme, what stories aren't influenced by our shared wonder at the prospect of death after all, but in the same way that the overblown opening credits works to set the mood, I think this works as well. These are games about choice and consequence, though rarely in the kind of philosophical sense you might find in other choice-driven games like Life is Strange or Telltale's The Walking Dead, where player choice is used to explore larger themes, often embracing the necessary limitations of choice in games to convey the character's powerlessness. Here in the Dark Pictures, with some notable exceptions we'll get to, player choice is all about the in-the-moment experience, a test of would your instincts get you out of this horrific situation alive that video games are uniquely capable of illustrating. It may be pretty surface level, but it embraces that superficiality, knowing full well that the question of if and how the player characters perish is the principal fun of the experience and tailoring the stories to emphasize that point. Given this, death playing host to events, literally and thematically, feels perfectly appropriate, and the Curator's frequent interludes do nicely unite the games under the banner of the Dark Pictures despite how aesthetically divergent each entry is from its peers. Of the three Dark Pictures games so far, Medan is the most concise and efficiently paced. The game wastes little time introducing us to its characters and setting those characters off on their adventure, allowing the player some say in their precise dynamics through dialogue options. They're not the most memorable cast, but they're likable enough, despite their entitlements and insecurities. But what slasher movie cast would work without the kinds of faults that get them into such harrowing circumstances in the first place? Each character is introduced with a few adjectives to give you a sense of their personality and some guidance if you're looking to roleplay rather than just follow your own instincts, and each has a menu's worth of traits that'll shift to reflect how the character is developed over the course of the game. This is a fine idea for tracking character dynamics and qualifying more minute moments of player choice, but what complicates it is the fact that these games are all designed to be played by two players in online co-op in the game's shared story mode, which is distinct from the movie night co-op mode, which has you sharing a screen and passing the controller from player to player depending on which character has control in any given scene. More so than any narrative or mechanical leaps, the Dark Pictures' attempts at crafting co-op interactive horror films is the series' most experimental facet, and it should be acknowledged, an ambitious experiment at that. The complexities of trying to balance a story so as to be enjoyed whether it's played alone, or with friends in the room one at a time, or with friends online simultaneously, is demanding, and the fact that the games all come together as coherently as they do in every mode is an accomplishment, but it has to be said that the experience is far from optimal. Movie Night's strength is that it allows players to handpick their characters, whom they'll then control whenever that character leads a scene, though this is hampered by the fact that the characters are not all given equal priority. So unless you've already played the game, you'll have no way of knowing how to balance this out among your players. If you're playing with a maximum party of 5, woe to the player who chooses Alex, because unless someone else dies early on, he won't have much to do, and may even wind up dead because of someone else's mistakes. Another downside to Movie Night, or even the solo mode, is that there'll always be a second half of the experience that goes unplayed, as the levels are all designed to have 2 active players at a time, meaning there's dialogue options and even major choices that aren't even given to the player. This is what the Curator's Cut is for, a way of playing the game that mixes in the second half of the experience usually reserved for shared story, though it comes at the cost of the first half, making it suitable for freshening up a second playthrough, but not much more. If you want full player control of every possible interaction in the game, you have to be playing in shared story, though in that case each player will miss 1 or 2 big scenes per game, as there are moments when 2 separate scenes will play out simultaneously, with only 1 player present each. I can see why this would annoy people who want to experience the full breadth of the game without having to play it multiple times, but this can actually work to the horror's favor, as it deprives both players of having a complete picture of what's going on, assuming you're not talking to each other outside the game anyway. Where shared story can hinder the experience is in how it seemingly doesn't care about consistently placing players in control of the same characters. I may be playing as Fliss in one scene and trying to characterize her as a stern, no-nonsense captain, but my second player may be handed control of her in the very next scene and decide she's affable and receptive to Conrad's obnoxious flirtations. Sometimes there's good reason for this, like when characters start dying off and the survivors have to be rebalanced between players, but in Medan, character swaps happened frequently and for seemingly no good reason. This isn't game breaking exactly, but having your portrayal of a character essentially overwritten by someone else and vice versa can really undermine any sense of ownership the player has over the story, which, in a game completely built around telling a story molded by the player's composite choices, does hurt a bit. The seemingly obvious solution of letting each player pick their characters at the start of the game, like in Movie Night mode, wouldn't work since the game doesn't want people playing online to suffer the same imbalance of playtime that's hard to avoid in Movie Night. The only real solution is for the game's level design to better account for this, and as I've said already, that is a tall order, especially here in Medan, where it was the developers' first swing at this sort of thing. And to their credit, they do eventually improve in this regard once we get to their most recent title, House of Ashes, which, in my shared playthrough, was much better about keeping players assigned to the same characters whenever possible. Even here in Medan, though, I can't hold the co-op's imperfections against the game too much, since I'm happy to see Supermassive willing to take a risk with such a challenging idea, which is more than can be said for the game's overall direction. Medan's premise is the most traditional of its peers, sticking to the familiar beats of classic horror that Until Dawn defined itself with, as we follow its college-age thrill-seekers on a misadventure that sees them breaking rules and getting in way over their heads. They begin by seeking out the rumored wreck of a World War II warplane in the Pacific, discovering the wreck and choosing not to report it to authorities before they can follow up on a lead it reveals for an even more enticing find, a note promising a haul of Manchurian gold at the plane's intended destination. Predictably, this hubris bites them in the ass when their boat is set upon by pirates, who take them captive and start demanding the Manchurian gold for themselves, which leads to the discovery of the Medan, still afloat amidst the waves. It's actually a while before the titular ship is arrived at, the first third or so of the game being spent with casual character building scenes that mesh well with the unexpectedly grounded threat of the pirates. They aren't afraid to hurt the characters, but they're also smart enough to know that killing them isn't in their best interest, though it can't happen if you push your luck hard enough. Navigating if and how you resist your captors makes for a fun couple of scenes where the pressure can reveal some of the characters' true colors before the meat of the game gets bitten into and the cast is pushed to their breaking point. Once the Medan is boarded, it acts as the setting for the remainder of the game. Derelict ships make up a whole subgenre of horror, and the Medan lives up to the tropes. Its gloomy, crooked corridors made all the more uncomfortable when you realize most of the protagonists are traversing this jagged rust bucket barefoot. Outside of cutscenes, Medan is framed through fixed camera perspectives, and I've seen complaints about this from fans who prefer the player-controlled cameras of the later games. While I mostly agree with this change for those games' respective settings, an unmoored camera really wouldn't serve well in the Medan's cramped quarters, the fixed camera allowing the developers the control to better set up the kind of persistent jump scares that have been their signature flourish since Until Dawn. This does a lot to make the simple act of exploring the space a tense act, as you can never be quite sure when something might be looking back at you from the corner of the screen. The sort of ambient tension I found the later games to be lacking in, thanks in large part to Medan's more controlled approach to its scene setting. You're not aboard the ship long before it becomes clear that the pirates themselves are in pretty far over their heads, unsure where on this precarious ship this supposed gold would be, if it's still there at all. The characters take the opportunity to slip away and explore the ship on their own, unable to flee as the lead pirate, Olsen, carries with him their boat's distributor cap, without which the boat's engine can't work. The goal of acquiring the cap while avoiding capture gets complicated as the characters wind up separated, and that's when things start to get weird. If you're just barreling through the game, not taking the time to soak in the notes and lore strewn about the place, Medan is likely a much different experience. Part of the fun of these game stories is trying to piece together what's going on based on what information can be gleaned from wayward notes and the characters' experiences. Delivering lore and non-essential information through diegetic sources is hardly a new mode of storytelling in games. In fact, it can often be seen as cliché thanks to a number of lazy implementations of it over the years. I'm looking at you, Neil Druckmann. But I found Supermassive's approach to it clever and thoughtful across all of their games, often more thoughtful than the more immediate storytelling. Should you opt to do the reading in Medan, it'll probably become clear fairly quickly that what you're seeing and hearing shouldn't be taken at face value. If you're playing as Fliss, the reason for all of this can be made pretty plain in one scene, where Fliss stumbles into a bizarrely well-maintained ballroom with a handful of unsettling touches that raise all sorts of questions, only for Fliss to step outside, get a few breaths of fresh air, and return to find the same room for what it really is. A cargo hold containing a compromised crate of a strange substance labeled Manchurian gold. You can piece together from notes and such that the gold was an experimental bioweapon that provokes fearful hallucinations in those exposed to it. The gold leaked from its container and permeated the halls of the Medan, driving the soldiers mad until they'd all killed each other off or died from panic-induced heart attacks. Even still, the gold hangs over the Medan, visible in wisps across the floor of its dark halls, and inducing terror in whoever spends too long below deck. There's a vocal segment of the Dark Pictures fanbase who really don't like that the horrors of Man of Medan aren't actually real in context, and on some level I do sympathize with this disappointment. The first few disturbing oddities you come across suggest something truly weird and sinister, so to discover that it was mostly an illusion of the character's subconscious is a bit of a letdown, especially since, excepting one or two cases, these hallucinations don't really tell us much about the characters who experience them. The potential strength of a hallucination-driven horror story is the opportunity to make scares out of the affected character's interiority, revealing aspects of their personality through monsters that abstractly represent their deepest fears. The monsters imagined by the characters of Man of Medan, however, are informed more by the environment, such as this gangly two-headed thing which will pop up if you examine a perplexing two-headed skeleton locked up in a casket deep in the ship, or a sequence where Conrad is chased by a wickedly distorted version of a sexy sailor girl he sees on a poster a few scenes prior. That's neat, but there's a missed opportunity here to use monster design that informs character development. The game instead relying on monsters that largely fall into the category of ugly scary that anyone witnessing would be rightly terrified of. Still, for my part, I didn't find the gold's hallucinatory effect a dissatisfying explanation of events, especially thanks to little touches, like discovering that it was the paranoia-stricken soldiers who shot down the plane you found in the beginning as it was coming to rescue them. And even if the threat is perhaps less exciting than it initially appears, it's still immediate in the form of the pirates, who've been breathing in just as much of the gold as you, and in their chemical-induced fear are volatile and prone to kill anyone they run into. Watching the pirates' leader Olsen descend from his confident "I'm the captain now" posturing to a babbling mess of a man wildly swinging a sledgehammer is a disturbing progression, making him a worthy final threat depending on how things play out. To the other pirates' credit though, Danny actually tries to help you and can be drowned for his trouble, while Junior can be reasoned with to an extent even as he's induced with the gold, and can even be saved if you play your cards right. Perhaps a greater threat still are the player characters themselves, who at times will see each other as monsters and may react aggressively. This is where the shared story really shines, as one player will see the other as a monster, running away and potentially hurting themselves in the process, or defending themselves and hurting the other player inadvertently. It's probably the most creative use of the series' co-op functionality so far, and if anything, I wish they had doubled down on it, maybe holding back a while longer on the reveals that make the hallucinatory nature of things so plain, so as to allow for more use of this idea before the players are likely to catch on. There's actually a decent amount of variability to how things can shake out. Assuming the characters aren't all dead, things can end brightly by acquiring the distributor cap or by calling for help through the ship's radio, or they can end bleakly with the survivors left adrift with no way of powering their ship and at the mercy of the sea. Even early game decisions can come back for big payoffs, like if Julia didn't take all the warnings about decompression sickness seriously, she'll straight up die in an after-credits scene. Or if Conrad managed to escape on the pirate's boat before even arriving at the Medan, he'll show up to save the other survivors at the end of the game, assuming they haven't escaped by some other means, in which case Conrad winds up getting himself stuck on the Medan alone. It's variation like this that makes revisiting the Medan worthwhile, just to see how differently things can play out. Overall, as a first pass at the smaller scale Dark Pictures formula, Man of Medan is solid enough, if a bit on the safe side. Going forward from here, though, the series will attempt a more creative approach to the same style of horror storytelling, finding some success, as well as modes of narrative that perhaps don't suit the formula's true strengths. While its peers stick to fairly straightforward narratives driven by the developers' takes on established horror themes, Little Hope is notable for having a more definitively concept-driven structure. It's too bad then that it falls the hardest on its face of the Dark Pictures so far in its actual execution. It isn't the fault of the concept, so much as a series of unfortunate presentational choices which push the format's typical beats to tedium for the sake of telling a story that wants to be ambiguously haunting but is instead vaguely confusing. Confusion is a fine feeling to start a horror story with, though, and in that sense Little Hope begins promisingly with a set of scenes that establish a bizarre, almost dreamy tone. We begin with a bus driver being diverted from his planned route through the town of Little Hope, a detour he's curiously anxious about. We hear the voices of his passengers chatting idly without ever actually seeing them, before the driver veers off the road to avoid a suspiciously spectral young girl in the street. The bus tips over, the ferryman logo on its side facing upwards in case the deathly imagery weren't hitting hard enough, and by this point it should be plainly apparent that the passengers on this bus aren't exactly on a regular field trip. Things get even weirder, though, as we then cut to a scene where we meet our main characters in an unideal domestic situation. The parents are fighting, the kids are uneasy, and the youngest, Megan, is especially struggling, but nobody's sure why or what to do about it. Playing the game for the first time in movie night mode, where you assign characters to players before starting the game, I'd seen all the characters' names and was thrown off to find they were all suddenly different, sharing only a first letter. This is likely an unintended quirk of playing the game in movie night mode, but it honestly threw me off, left me questioning the nature of the reality the game was establishing, which, intentional or not, well serves the ominous mood and overall arc of the narrative. The scene eventually erupts into chaos as a fire breaks out, started by Megan, who is shown briefly to have a sort of demonic figure at her back, possibly manipulating her into the act. We watch as, one by one, all the characters die gruesomely, except Will Porter's Anthony, whom we last see rushing into the house in a despairing, suicidal gesture. The Anthology's signature intro plays, and we're again introduced to the curator, only to then be set back down at the bus crash, its passengers tangibly present this time, while the bus driver is mysteriously missing. The characters rally, all of them sharing faces and similar names to the people who were just shown dying in the house fire, though having no apparent relationship with one another besides being a college class on a field trip. From here, things truly begin, as the characters proceed into town to find help. We won't be getting back to that house fire for a while, and when we do, it'll be after a great deal of shit has gone down, enough that the fire is like a half-forgotten dream by the time its significance is made clear. Through all this, Little Hope very deliberately establishes that things are not what they seem right off the bat. As a setup for a horror story, it had me absolutely hooked, trying to piece together what was going on in a way that, for a moment at least, was distinctly captivating from what any of Supermassive's titles had yet to even attempt. Sure, Medan's hallucinatory toxin altered the character's perceptions in a way that has you questioning your senses, but Little Hope's setup distorts reality to an inscrutable degree, suggesting a story far more cerebral and weird than Medan's relatively clear-cut premise wound up being. The way things proceed from here, though, it quickly starts to feel less like the game's purposefully cultivating an atmosphere of unease, and more like the story's just being told quite sloppily. I was eager initially to write off a lot of the game's shortcomings in its direction or writing as part of some big picture concept. Like, if this is some kind of purgatory, as plenty of things would suggest, or a dream even, then that might explain the characters acting inconsistent and obtuse, right? And while the big picture of Little Hope does turn out to be informed by a concept in that general ballpark, it never succeeds in portraying its world or characters with the nuance that truly committing to such an idea would demand. Sticking to the characters for a moment, the interactions here are a notable step back in believability and charisma from where they were in Medan, which itself was a step back from Supermassive's previous work in that department. I'd lay this at the feet of the game's overbearing writing more so than the actors' performances, though those certainly aren't all made equal either. Conversations are often little more than tedious over-explanations of how the characters are interpreting what's going on, which, in aggregate, really undermines the dreamy tone the intro worked so hard to establish. Obviously, people in this situation would be trying to figure shit out, but when every instance of something spooky happening is followed by everyone taking a moment to have a fruitless conversation where they conclude that something weird is going on and we have no way of knowing what or why and we should just keep going, things get stale fast. Perhaps if the player's dialogue options allowed for more interesting variance in these conversations, it'd be different, but you're rarely given anything more interesting to say than expressing one character's opinion about something another character said. While these largely arbitrary choices are supposed to impact how each character's personality is developed, as indicated by their constantly shifting traits and relationships, that doesn't stop them from being inconsistent, often getting needlessly hostile with one another only moments after connecting and sympathizing. Some of this is certainly a result of the game's writing having to reconcile the various possible permutations a conversation can take based upon player choice, but when that results in conversations that seem to go in and out of context and feel like an assemblage of disparate lines cut together like a gamer poop bit, something is clearly wrong. As to the world and the broader interactions that make up the actual experience of playing the game, Little Hope is a pretty boring affair. You'll be walking the same dark, fog-stricken street with the occasional alcove of optional reading material for most of the game, unless of course you're exploring another samey, derelict location between your treks down the dark, fog-stricken street. The environmental storytelling isn't without its poignancy, portraying an all too familiar small American town sunken into depression and disrepair. Most creepy are the hints at the characters' various lives throughout the town's history, black and white photos with oddly familiar faces, names resembling that of the characters popping up on posters, plaques, tombstones, suggesting a cycle of death and atrophy that has them in its clutches, which adds a lot to the ominous atmosphere. It's just too bad how much of it starts to bleed together after a while, the repetitive environments and encounters not doing enough to distinguish themselves. Now, if we're being entirely honest about how these games are to play, Little Hope isn't mechanically any different from the other Dark Pictures games. All principally involve walking around, picking things up to turn over in your hand, and occasionally clicking button prompts under varying degrees of pressure, so calling it boring in relation to the others may seem unfair. I think the difference here is pacing. Man of Medan was slow to build, but it never stagnated in escalating the tension through to its conclusion, and House of Ashes is action-focused in a way distinct from its peers. Little Hope banks early on atmosphere and intrigue over thrills and action, and with what we've discussed so far undermining its atmosphere and intrigue, the lack of thrills and action is more tangibly felt. Things eventually get more in your face, but it takes a decent amount of time before there's any real threat to the characters, and in that time, Little Hope's worst tendencies are given far too much space to flaunt themselves. The most engaging part of the game, at least initially, comes from the Puritan era flashbacks to Little Hope's past, where the characters witness the town's history of Salem-style witch trials play out with yet another set of doppelgangers of themselves as the victims, their deaths reflecting their respective deaths from the opening scene. John, for instance, was killed by collapsing rubble in the house, and his Puritan self is executed via the exceptionally cruel method of being slowly crushed by stacking rocks on his chest until it caves in. When these flashbacks first started, I was immediately intrigued. I'm a sucker for that Crucible aesthetic, especially when there's an overtly occult element at play, and watching this rendition of the characters go through the expected beats of the witch hunt narrative serves as an important parallel to the characters' own experiences and rationalizations of what's happening to them. Perhaps more importantly, these scenes wind up being pretty much the only points where the game's story actually moves forward in a meaningful way, giving the characters something to latch onto besides their default of bickering about how shitty the situation is. Even these sequences lose their magic after enough repetitions, though. I counted 12 in my shared story playthrough, with at least 2 that only the other players saw. Each flashback is prompted by what is practically the same jump scare of a ghostly figure grabbing the character and pulling them into the scene. Cheap and frequent jump scares are part of the supermassive horror formula, I wouldn't complain about that, but seeing what is essentially the same scare over and over again really takes the edge off its effectiveness, and by the time you're getting to the last few flashbacks, they just feel redundant. Even the content of the scenes becomes redundant through repetition, as it'll eventually become clear that the doppelgangers are all going to die in a manner similar to their counterparts' death in the house fire, and once you realize that, there's not much left to these scenes, or the game at large, that's all that exciting, let alone terrifying. The potential exception being the demons, who arrive to stalk the modern characters and appear in correspondence with the deaths of their Puritan doppelgangers, their designs reflecting their respective prey's deaths. Once John's Puritan self is crushed to death, for instance, a demon with a broken, twisted body will come for him, moving about in sickening, unnatural contortions. While the demons are creatively designed and suitably unnerving, their capacity to scare the player is undermined by their predictability, an unfortunate result of the clear pattern of encounters that Little Hope settles into once they start showing up. Explore an area until you get jump scared and watch a flashback. Repeat until a character in the flashback is executed, which then places that character's modern counterpart in danger, which also essentially guarantees that they won't have much to do from this point on, since the writing has to account for the possibility that they've already died. Rinse and repeat for all the characters except Andrew, for reasons that'll be clear in a moment here, and then the game's pretty much over. I know that when you boil down all of these games in a way that is easily displayed on a wiki page, a similar pattern is revealed where some characters are exposed to danger earlier than others who have themselves a thick breastplate of plot armor, but only in Little Hope is that pattern apparent enough to make even a first playthrough disappointingly foreseeable. I was exhausted with Little Hope by the time it had come to its final scenes, which made caring about the dilemma it poses difficult. Events culminate in a final flashback which sees the town of Little Hope holding a trial for the girl Mary, doppelganger to the first scene's Megan and the principal accuser in the witch hunt. Mary herself is now being accused of purposefully deceiving the town as well as partaking in witchcraft. Andrew's double, Abraham, is looking to his modern counterpart for wisdom and how to proceed, knowing that something needs to be done to address the undeniable darkness hanging over Little Hope, but unsure if Mary is truly to blame. Your options are to convince him to accuse Mary, to burn Mary's puppet out of the belief that the devil is exerting influence through it, or to turn the accusation against the priest, Reverend Carver, who's been the overseer of the witch hunt and seemingly guiding Mary along in her accusations. Now, I can only speak to my subjective experience with the game, but come on, it's obviously the priest. Even if you don't read any of the multiple notes implicating him and his duplicates in the occult, or if his barely concealed predatory intentions with Mary go over your head, the curator himself in an earlier interlude beckons you not to hold too much against Mary, as she's only a child, even when I told that sneaky little man I didn't want any hints. The question of if Mary should be held accountable for what she did is complex, and the player's deliberation on it thematically significant, but all that sours a bit in the face of there not being any real debate to be had over who the real monster here is. Regardless, your decision in the trial is the single most important decision in determining how Little Hope ends, though what variability there is to its conclusion is easily forgotten in the face of the grander reveal of what exactly has been going on the whole time. There was a sense of disappointment from fans about Medan's hallucinatory nature, but that response was absolutely trumped by the outcry against Little Hope's ending, which, popular sentiment seems to go, undermines all the good the game had going for it by rendering it all pointless right at the end. I disagree with this sentiment, as not only do I actually kinda like the ending conceptually, but as I think I've thoroughly outlined, Little Hope's problems start long before the ending puts everything in context. So, what happens? The surviving characters find themselves at the house that burned to the ground at the beginning of the game, and after the trial flashback, reality sets in as it is revealed that the characters are all, in fact, figments of Andrew's imagination. Andrew himself not even being who he's seen himself as, actually being the bus driver who swerved off the road at the start of the game, who himself is Anthony from the house fire, the only survivor of that terrible tragedy. Fueled by a combination of unprocessed trauma and a head wound, sparked by his unplanned return to the town where it all went down, Anthony experienced an all encompassing delusional fantasy wherein he was forced to face his guilt and grief. What we experience in playing the game is Anthony's reconciliation with the awful events of that fateful night, either coming to terms with his loss and regaining the capacity to move on, or, in the darker variants of the ending, succumbing to grief and ending his own life. Now, I want to be clear that I don't actually find this ending all that satisfying, but not on the principle that it all being in Anthony's head is inherently cheap, as I do think there's a lot to this concept that is cool and deserves acknowledgement before we start tearing it apart. My initial reaction to all this as the credits rolled was, if this was all about some guy's guilt over his family's death, what the heck was with all that witch trial stuff? It's a bit whiplash inducing for so much of the game to be focused on the mystery of the character's connection to their past selves, only for that past to seemingly be just another layer to the fantasy, and a convoluted one at that. Ultimately, though, I buy it as an abstract concoction of Anthony's mind, growing up as he did in Little Hope, a town which wore its history of witch trials on its sleeve, inseparable from the town itself. The prevailing lesson of the witch trials, that guilt and innocence can all too easily be obfuscated by fear, connects to Anthony's experience, and in the context of the fantasy, embodies his own struggle with assigning blame for what happened the night of the fire. When written out in such broad, conceptual strokes, I like this idea a lot. Once you start asking more specific questions about why this or that is happening, though, things kind of fall apart. Here are some of the questions I had, anyway. Why are the other characters besides Andrew being sought out and punished by demons for being sinful? Them being hunted and struggling to avoid facing the same deaths they've suffered time and time again makes a kinda sense, but in the end, whether they live or die, so to speak, is explicitly tied to how they develop as characters. If they fail to be virtuous in specific moments, they will automatically be killed off following the trial. You can make it all the way to the end of the game without having lost a single character, only for everyone but Andrew to get massacred in the house. Why is this a part of Anthony's fantasy? Is he judging his family as part of his rationalization of what happened, determining that some of them deserved their fate? That could have gone somewhere, I suppose, but as is, it just feels off base. Unless there is, in fact, some genuine supernatural trickery going on behind the scenes, which some evidence might suggest, though a lot of that can be written off as just another part of Anthony's delusion. But what about the demonic presence visible over Megan's shoulder just before the fire starts? Was it somehow the priest's influence actively manipulating her, as is the case in the Puritan flashbacks? Or was it merely a symbolic representation of Mary's resentment towards her family for not protecting her from the priest? Or was it really just a demon? The characters in the flashbacks being doppelgangers of the main cast tracks, but why the hints at other variations of the characters throughout Little Hope's history? Without a concrete reason for the repeated incarnations of these same people in this same place, what does this actually say about Anthony's state of mind? And perhaps most troubling of all, why, if they're meant to represent Anthony's dead brother and sister, are Daniel and Taylor romantically involved? I mean, I get that they're adopted siblings, and that's different than if they were blood related, but it's still really weird that this is how Anthony's mind constructs them, right? Like, why? Just why? If you're like me, it can be fun to play around with these questions, to turn them over in your mind and try to piece them together into a clearer, cohesive whole. I've been trying for a year now to do this with Little Hope, and all I've managed to do is make myself more confused. Ambiguity is not the problem. In fact, ambiguity is warranted and useful for this kind of story. Anthony's struggle to come to terms with what happened are in large part because of what he cannot know, of what he'll never know about Megan's motivation and about the suffering his family endured because of her actions, or about what any of them could have done to help her and prevent it had they not been caught up in their own unhappiness. Ambiguity is the reason a fantasy such as this is necessary for Anthony's healing, or lack thereof, as only an elaborate fantasy abstractly exploring the people and context involved can help Anthony make sense of what happened to him. The problem is when ambiguity crosses over into vagueness, the difference being that ambiguity implies various possible explanations, each informed and justified by different facts that don't contradict one another, leaving nothing but one's own subjectivity to decide what must have really happened, while vagueness is simply a blank space, not filled in with enough substance to make any real sense out of one way or another, with whatever evidence you do have contradicted or nonsensical when looked at from an unfavorable angle. The idea at the center of Little Hope works, but it's hindered by all that goes on around it, by questions the game presents seemingly to build intrigue, but never actually puts in the effort to justify satisfactorily. Frankly, I'm not sure Little Hope could ever have properly executed on its idea running with the established Dark Pictures framework. I see two ways things could have gone better, both requiring cutting out one significant feature of the game in favor of bolstering another. The first and simplest way would be to forget the whole framing of Anthony's guilt trip and Housefire, and to just tell a more straightforward story of the group stumbling into Little Hope and uncovering a dark history that they are somehow implicated in. I won't muse on the many ways the story could unfold from there, as it could be anything once freed from the restrictive, thematically dependent framing of the fantasy, perhaps going even further and embracing the witch trials aesthetic and the character's cyclical connection to the town. I consider this the simpler way, as it wouldn't really ask much of Supermassive that they haven't already had experience with, playing to their strengths and taking little risk. The more complex way would be to trim out the witch trials part of the game entirely so as not to distract from a more overtly dreamlike aesthetic, doubling down on the entire experience being a fantasy and allowing that idea to better permeate the game's direction and writing. If we're in a sort of dream, let the environments reflect that by being increasingly disorienting. Let the haunting menace at the characters' heels be rooted in the same anxieties that define the world's construction. If these characters are truly meant to be allegorical representations of Anthony's dead family, let them fully act as allegories. Let them be strange and inconsistent in ways that reflect Anthony's own deliberation on their character and on himself. To that end, I just don't think the Dark Pictures standard of 5 playable characters really suits the concept, which would be better served by having the player exclusively play as Andrew, allowing the other characters to more precisely embody whatever they're supposed to embody, and for the player to react to them more precisely in kind. It would be the far more ambitious project, one perhaps too outside the box for the Dark Pictures franchise, but the fact is that Little Hope's ambitions don't have a proper outlet in the current formula, so without a willingness to depart from that, I just don't really see the concept flourishing in the way I believe it otherwise could. Still, on some level, it's reassuring to see that Supermassive opted for something perhaps too ambitious for their own good, rather than settling for the same safe beats that defined Man of Medan. While their next title dials back on the experimentation in favor of something more expected, the results convey a renewed understanding for what these games excel at, something Little Hope was unfortunately lacking in. If what you're looking for out of the Dark Pictures experience is an intricate web of choices and action sequences that create a diverse array of possible paths through a story, House of Ashes is by far the easiest to recommend. While I haven't actually done the math, I'd confidently wager the QTE to time played ratio is higher here than the previous games, Supermassive wisely shifting the focus towards action and high stakes decision making. This, along with its unique setting and inventive take on the classic monster at its heart, feels like a breath of fresh air for the franchise, a reassurance after the missteps of Little Hope that Supermassive still knows how to deliver the kind of thrilling, if straightforward, interactive story that put them on the map in the first place. There's also a more prominent effort in the game's writing to ground the experience around a few central ideas, namely the rippling damage of war and the struggle of individuals to overcome the entrenched bitterness it creates. For they have sown the wind, and they shall reap the whirlwind, the game's opening shot spells out, a biblical quote that rather succinctly sums up mankind's history of war. We're given a more direct lesson to its point through the prologue, which sets us in ancient Akkad, as a war brews between the Akkadians and their longtime enemies, the Gutians. The Akkadian king has ordered the mass execution of the Gutian people, believing that their bloodshed shall appease the gods he pissed off after sacking one of their temples, their wrath evident in the plague and famine that ravished the empire. All that this death really accomplishes is awakening a long-buried threat from its slumber deep beneath the temple grounds, a threat which rises up to slaughter Akkadian and Gutian alike. Playing in shared story, one player will control an Akkadian general while the other controls a Gutian prisoner, whose mutual animus for one another must be tempered in the face of the sudden demonic threat which seeks to exterminate everyone regardless of allegiance. It's a short sequence, but one that firmly establishes the game's central theme of cooperation between enemies, and in a way that actually utilizes the player's limited interactivity. When one of the demons corners the two, both players must opt to stand and fight, though both have the option of betraying the other to try and save themselves. Of course, this is a Dark Pictures prologue, so no matter what you do, both men end up dead, or dead adjacent anyway, but this brief test of faith works to introduce the idea and shows the challenge of making peace with one's sworn enemy. With these ideas established, the game transitions to its main setting in the midst of the US-led invasion of Iraq. While the Iraq War has been a lightning rod of political discourse for almost 20 years now, we've reached a point where the prevailing attitude towards it is a sort of somber malaise, contemporary justifications for the invasion proving over time to be either naively misguided or outright fabricated. Sure, Saddam Hussein was a shitbag who probably had it coming, but given the years of turbulence that came in the wake of the invasion and the hundreds of thousands of lives lost from soldiers and civilians alike, it takes some stalwart cognitive dissonance to not admit that the war's long-term effects reflect rather poorly on the nations who insisted upon its necessity. House of Ashes may not take any outright political stance, but that malaise of hindsight hangs in the air and bleeds into the story. We meet our characters as they occupy Saddam's abandoned palatial estate, patting themselves on the back for sending the bad man running and secure in their faith that the worst of the conflict is behind them. The player knows better. and the effect is foreboding. It's no accident that the character's mission is to discover the hiding place of Iraq's supposed WMDs, the existence of which was one of the principal justifications for the invasion, though in the years that followed it would become clear that there was never substantial evidence of such weapons being in Iraq's possession, and that the US government's insistence to the contrary was deliberately misleading. The player knows that whatever anomaly has been detected by the Kalis program is not Saddam's chemical weapons, but Eric King and company don't, and by God, they'll raid the shit out of those shepherd's huts if that's what protecting the free world demands. It's maybe easy to judge these characters for their self-righteous ignorance, but their naivety was the naivety of a nation, a shared fervor in the immediate post-9/11 world to push back against some hard-to-define other, with powerful, opportunistic forces exploiting that fervor and aiming its wrath squarely at oil-rich Iraq. Almost 20 years down the road, it's easy to look back and scoff at how the American public was manipulated, how leaders got away with starting a war over blatantly dishonest claims. It's similarly easy to look back on the actions of the Akkadian king, systematically executing the Gutian people to appease the gods, and see how that probably wasn't all that necessary or righteous either. The parallel being established between Iraq's ancient conflicts and the US invasion is simple but effective at illustrating how the nature of war hasn't changed across the vast timeline of human history. However advanced we may perceive our society to be relative to Akkad, we're still being driven to conflict by our fear of the other, whether we put a label on that other like with the Gutians, or that other is an amorphous anxiety where any perceived threat, real or invented, fits the bill. Once it has begun, war is self-perpetuating, grievances on all sides of a conflict piling up until none can help but see the world through a tribalistically defensive lens, thus inevitably spawning more conflict. This pattern has played out countless times across history, and despite the supposedly more rational disposition of our modern age, we still cannot help but give into it, allowing our worst natures to lead us blindly into more and more unnecessary death. Here we are, in the formative years of the 21st century AD, still reaping the whirlwind. The moment in House of Ashes that actually frightened me the most was not the moment an ungodly monster burst from the darkness to sink its fangs into my character's neck, but the moment where during the fighting between American and Iraqi forces, the ground gives away, soldiers tumbling into a dark abyss that had been just beneath their feet, the sun shining for the first time in millennia on the face of an Akkadian statue, unearthed and shockingly close to the surface, as if the 4,000 years between its time and ours were nothing at all. In reality, the tangled, complicated problems of war only have tangled, complicated solutions, but House of Ashes embraces its horror roots to offer a simple remedy. Perhaps all it takes to awaken our empathy and make peace with those we've demonized is to encounter actual, honest-to-God demons, which has a way of putting things into perspective. Enter the cave-dwelling vampires who stalk our protagonist through their subterranean labyrinth, looking for blood and the chance to spread their strange disease onto hosts anew. Beyond sticking to the basic cliches of vampire mythology, blood good, sun bad, etc., House of Ashes vampires fit well into the famous monsters canon of representing man's myriad evils. The archetype of the aristocratic vampire, for instance, is commonly used to critique the social order, portraying the ruling class as parasitic monsters who leech off the labor and essence of those beneath them. The vampires in House of Ashes, contrarily, are blind and bestial, surviving on the spoils of mankind's wars, reflecting our vicious, warmongering nature in their ferocity. For plenty of fans, it was enough just to be up against actual, tangible monsters this time around, but I want to praise House of Ashes vamps for being a smart take on what the vampire broadly represents, on top of just being a cool-looking monster. The whole theme of cooperation between enemies may have been better served by a cast properly proportioned between the war's conflicting sides, since as it is, 4 of the 5 characters are US military, while only 1 is an Iraqi soldier. Though, in fairness, that Iraqi soldier is probably the most likable protagonist to grace the Dark Pictures yet. Far from the gung-ho soldier cliches typical to games, and farther still from the faceless, nameless cannon fodder Middle Eastern soldiers are especially marginalized as, Salim is portrayed as an ordinary guy, whose involvement in the war is merely a matter of making ends meet and supporting his son Zayn. When Salim's comrades come to pick him up to meet the approaching Americans in combat, he agrees to go along reluctantly, more concerned with how to handle his son's bad habits than he is with the war, contrasted to his zealous captain Dar, who's unwilling to accept that the war is already lost, craving battle with his country's invaders for the sake of it. Salim doesn't share Dar's prideful enthusiasm for fighting a losing fight, he just wants to go home, take a bath, and listen to the radio. All of the playable characters in the Dark Pictures can be played in ways ranging from abrasive douchebaggery to overly charitable softies. But even when choosing the coldest and most ruthless options for Salim, he remains sympathetic and grounded in his humanity. It also helps that he proves the most competent at slaying vampires, wielding a bent metal stake that somehow does more damage to the creatures than a magazine of assault rifle rounds. But hey, that's vampires for you. The American characters are not as universally likable, the love triangle between Eric, Rachel, and Nick feeling trite even by Supermassive's cliché-loving standards, but as a whole the cast is more compellingly written than that of the previous 2 games. with some welcome moments of vulnerability to be found within the game's web of possibilities. House of Ashes cuts to the chase a bit quicker than its peers, with only a sparse few scenes of exposition before the mission kicks off. As it dawns on the Americans that the only chemical weapons present at the site of the anomaly are a few blocks of heroin under the floorboards, Salim's patrol launches a counterattack, the explosive effects of which send anyone not killed in the battle tumbling into the Akkadian ruins below. From here, the vampires make their debut almost instantaneously, leaving the scattered protagonists scrambling to survive as they gradually piece together what the heck is going on. The pacing here keeps you on your toes, never going too long between action sequences, thus allowing the slower sections of exploring the ruins and reading up on lore to feel like breaks in the tension rather than laborious padding. While functionally not all that different from the previous game's environments, the dusty corridors of the Akkadian ruins have a unique dread, and only get more alien and disturbing the deeper the characters go. One of the more viscerally unsettling scenes sees Rachel at the bottom of a pitch-black chasm, waist deep in a viscous, bloody substance and forced to wade past ominous bubbles that follow in her wake, which had me on the edge of my seat anticipating the inevitable ambush in a way I hadn't been for most of the series. The action sequences around the midpoint of the game act as a crossroads where the disparate paths of the different characters meet, bringing with them a diversity of variables that shape how the action unfolds in a way that really highlights what can make the action in these games so rewarding. It's not a matter of mechanical engagement, limited as it is to pressing buttons and aiming reticles as directed, but how decisions leading up to a scene can alter it, coloring it in with detail and flavor that help make the scene distinct to the player's experience, as well as how the chaos of the scene can reshape events going forward. There's nothing wrong with using plainly apparent, hard-hitting choices to guide the player's influence over the story, but mixing more deliberate player choice with sequences that are more determined by your reactivity, sometimes even punishing you for being too quick to act, creates a more dynamic experience and lends the moments of decision-making greater weight. This is a facet of all the Dark Pictures games, of course, but House of Ashes does the best at making its action sequences sing through a compelling composition of choices big and small. The assault on the main temple, for instance, is variable in a plethora of fun ways. Is Eric alive to utilize his handy UV stick against the vamps, or has he already died off? How did Jason and Nick set up the tripwires, and do they remember well enough to keep the others from triggering them? Did Rachel get Clarice out of the chasm, and does she keep Jason from killing her out of fear she's turning into a vampire? All of these factors and more influence how the scene is set, which in turn affects the kind of decisions being made in the moment. Variables compound as one major set piece leads into another, this time with Salim and Dar in the mix. Where do they stand? Does Salim choose to defend Rachel when she's pinned rather than take aim at the vampire lunging for him? Even actions from the game's prologue have an effect, as either the Akkadian general or the Gutian prisoner will still be around in the form of an ancient vampire, powerful, unnerving, and quite likely to rip out Eric's throat if someone else hasn't already. It's little touches like this that make the game feel reactive and personal, or they at least craft a compelling illusion of reactivity so as to keep the player curious to see how their actions, both deliberate and by mishap, ripple through to the story's conclusion. Following this mid-game blowout, players will find themselves saddled with the reluctant duo of Jason and Salim, whose interactions in the last act of the game serve as the real heart of the enemy of my enemy theme. Jason and Salim are skeptical of each other, naturally given their respective allegiances, but being forced to put that aside for the very practical reason of vampires gives them the chance to see each other as men instead of enemy combatants. There's plenty of genuinely funny, antagonistic banter between the two, but the real substance of how the relationship develops is left to the player through some surprisingly robust dialogue options. There's more to both of these characters than meets the eye. Salim the brave, good-humored soldier who doesn't hate his country's invaders so much as he resents their ignorance, while Jason's true depth hide behind a facade of stoic, country boy patriotism. Only with Salim, if the two begin to foster a friendship, does the more authentic Jason come out, the one whose attitude about his country is more jaded and measured than I think either I or Salim had given him credit for. A lot of this comes out at a moment where Jason discusses a particularly haunting incident he experienced with Nick, one that's hung over the heads of both soldiers for the duration of the game, but only gets fully explained if Jason chooses to open up to Salim. Jason ordered a woman shot for not standing down as she passed a military checkpoint, only to find out afterwards that she couldn't hear his commands because she was wearing headphones. It's the kind of accident that's tragic but inevitable in such a large-scale war, not that that provides Jason any relief, his confident facade crumbling as he speaks about what he's done. He even admits to Salim that before the war he was a going-nowhere-fast stoner who, despite having the Twin Towers sketched on his cap, wasn't even aware that 9/11 had happened until a week later. He joined the army because it was something to pull him out of his rut, to give him purpose, and while he's done well for himself, it's also left him confused, struggling to reconcile his feelings of duty towards his country and the awful, guilty things serving that country has demanded. All game long, Jason has held this in while proudly championing a nationalistic, often xenophobic attitude toward the war. Keep in mind, he can do some pretty heinous shit should the player choose, especially during the raid on the Shepherds. Not to mention that one of his introductory adjectives is literally intolerant. But here, he betrays a much more conflicted outlook, its vulnerability all the more telling for how he only now reveals it to an enemy, but has been too afraid to do the same with any allies. It may not be the most original character writing out there, but it's nuanced and reflective to a greater degree than I'd come to expect from these games. Of course, the scene is entirely optional, the player free to instead brush off the impulse to share and maintain a sense of stoicism. The choice to open up makes doing so feel significant, the player able to decide what this journey has meant to Jason, how it's made him reflect upon himself in such a way as to possibly provoke this confession. It makes me wish for more character writing like this in these games, more moments where the player gets to define a character's arc with climactic dialogue choices, rather than just being able to define their surface personality. I think they could also benefit from more character dynamics like that between Jason and Salim, whose team-up works as both the nicer path of a burgeoning brotherhood forged in battle, or, if you insist on playing mean, a rich and tragic rivalry, both paths being served well by the game's handling of the characters. With few options left to them, Jason and Salim descend even further towards the green glow of the vampire's domain. I wasn't kidding when I described the environments as getting more alien the deeper you get. The clusters of radiant green moss, the hollow cocoons of vampires already awakened, the vast spaces dwarfing the characters. It feels straight out of Prometheus and makes for a refreshing change of scenery after the hour spent among the bones of a cod. As an aesthetic shift, it adds a welcome dose of mystique to the game's back half. That is, until Rachel, having been bitten by a vampire and suffering the effects of its slow transformation, suddenly experiences a vision of a ship falling towards primal Earth, and gains from this the definitive knowledge that vampires are indeed aliens who've been festering in the Earth even before the dawn of mankind. This vision completely took the air out of the whole thing for me. There's plenty of ways to pull off the "they were actually aliens" trick without it coming off as ridiculous as it sounds. To gesture towards an alien origin for the vampires using the aesthetic composition of their lair is subtle, classy. Flatly stating it outright is decidedly less classy, especially when it's through such a contrived narrative device as a bite-implanted vision. Seriously, what the heck is this? It's not even from an actual point of view, she's just standing in space watching the ship fall to the Earth. I mean, come on. The conditions for getting this scene are pretty specific, so it's entirely possible that you'll miss it in any given playthrough of the game, but there are other, admittedly more naturalistic, sources of information that give the characters quite the crisp picture of the vampire's origins, such as a diary from an archaeologist who had the time to figure it all out. Naturalistic, yes, but still very convenient. It's not simply a matter of how the information is delivered, but that the developers felt the need to deliver it at all. I'm all for Supermassive having thought this out. I'm glad that they have answers to questions like, where did the vampires come from originally, and how did they communicate with one another? But I'm not sure I wanted such clear answers to those kinds of questions. Nothing kills fear like understanding, and setting it up so that the characters are pretty effortlessly able to comprehend what the vampires are does exactly that. It's as if the developers felt the need to show their work, to prove that they'd thought it all through rather than letting whatever lore they'd written more subtly inform the aesthetic and story, which is exactly what it was doing up until the point the game decided to do away with all of its ambiguity, perhaps having took the wrong lesson away from people's frustration with Little Hope's vagueness. What takes place in the vampire's domain is appropriately exciting, at least, the game offering up yet another flexible, fun action sequence where the surviving characters do whatever they can to ensure the blood-hungry menace won't reach the surface. It culminates in perhaps the most thematically significant decision the player has to make. Does Jason go back for Salim? There's no avoiding the circumstances of the choice. Jason and Salim will always survive up to this point and will always get separated, Salim always the one in need of saving. That's unfortunate in the sense that it pretty severely limits both characters from diverging all that meaningfully from their destined paths, but it's a concession made for the sake of thematic follow-through, and if it has to be this way, at least the game was smart enough to cast its best-written characters for the part. Regardless of how you've shaped the relationship between Jason and Salim, the choice and its consequences are narratively satisfying. Saving Salim means Jason's putting his neck on the line, either for an unlikely new friend or for a rival he's come to respect. Leaving Salim is either a cowardly betrayal of the trust the two had forged, or Jason embracing the hateful, uncharitable outlook he'd only really been trying on up to that point. There's something sadly appropriate about Salim's fate ultimately being left to the whims of an American soldier as well. He, and all of Iraq really, have been at the mercy of such forces since the war began. The Iraqi army never had a chance against the US-led coalition. They got bulldozed during the initial invasion. The vast majority of fighting in the war ended up being between the coalition and insurgent forces that rose up in the invasion's aftermath, at which point the country had been fully tossed into a whirlwind of chaos, the damage of which is still being reaped to this day. Salim can only survive if Jason decides he's worth it, a defining moment for Jason's character, and a gloomy reflection of Salim's agency in the face of forces far greater than one Iraqi soldier, however nice a guy he might be. If anyone survives the mad dash out from underground, they'll get a moment to bask in the relief of sunshine. But only a moment, as out of nowhere an eclipse darkens the sky and the vamps strike in one last all-out assault. I'll give the game credit for catching me off guard with this one. I really thought we'd reached the end of things, But House of Ashes is intent on one last balls to the wall brawl before the day is through. The characters find themselves exhausted of all resources but their knives and a healthy supply of flares. So they grip a blade in one hand and the light in another, and what ensues is the most absurd fight sequence the Dark Pictures has produced yet. On the one hand, it really is one action scene too far, the game at this point having gone on notably longer than either of its peers, with quite a bit of the back half having been action sequences that, while less outwardly crazy, play exactly like this one. I've been generous regarding the merits of the QTE system, as I do often enjoy it despite its simplicity, but I suppose even I have a limit for how much of it I can take before its insufficiencies start to annoy me, and I reached that limit somewhere in the middle of this fight in both of my playthroughs. On the other hand though, it is such an exuberantly batshit sequence, I mean just look at it. All these characters going ham on the vampires, and seemingly having an easier time at it now than they did when they had guns. It's ludicrous, a completely over-the-top, last-minute reminder of the B-horror sensibilities that run through the series' DNA. Despite how it really highlighted my exhaustion with the game's mechanical framework, I can't help but smile at the utter madness of it all. When the eclipse passes, the vampires retreat to their dark dwelling, and the game concludes. As ready as I was for House of Ashes to be done, I was more ready than any of the previous games to jump back in soon after, so much more dynamic it felt than either Man of Medan or Little Hope. While it likely doesn't do anything to appease players who've already had their fill of these games and the predictable beats that make up the experience of playing them, it is, in terms of writing, directing, and design, flat out the strongest entry in the Dark Pictures to date, a fact which bodes well for the franchise's future. The finale to the first season of the anthology is to be released next year and will be called The Devil in Me. The teaser gives the impression that it'll be a return to the Saw vein of horror that Until Dawn tapped into a bit. I think that's a smart choice for the series, as it's easy to imagine the ways it might put the player in terrible choice-making circumstances, especially with co-op in mind, and the teaser is already more disturbing than a lot of what the series has produced so far. A part of me wanted to wait until The Devil in Me to finish this video, to have the whole season contained in the one unit, but I couldn't resist getting to work on writing about the games we've already gotten. I don't imagine anything I've said here will have changed anyone's mind about the games. If they aren't your thing, they still won't be now, but they are my thing. A special sort of game I can't help but love, however ungame-like they often aspire to be. It's been a joy these last few years, having a new spooky adventure to dip into every Halloween season, and I'll miss it when the series likely takes a hiatus after the next installment. I look forward to The Devil in Me, but I look forward to what comes next even more, for the project Supermassive can embark on with the full experience of these past 3 games under their belt. Will it mean bolder stories that more creatively utilize the series' assets? Will it mean brave departures from the limitations of the series' somewhat tired framework? Will it mean mechanical involvement beyond pushing a button and pushing it fast? Maybe. Hopefully. Probably not. Whatever the case, you can bet I'll be there day one to soak it all up. God help me. Hello. If you're hearing this, then that means you've reached the end of the video. And allow me to say, thank you very much. I spent a lot of time on this, so I genuinely appreciate that you also put the time into it. And I hope you enjoyed it, or at the very least found it interesting. If you did, then you might be interested in checking out some of the other videos I have up on my channel. And if you like those, feel free to subscribe, because I'll probably have more content like it sometime in the future. Obviously, these videos are not a comprehensive analysis of everything all of these games have to offer. I tried to just focus on the things that seemed important to me. So if there is anything you feel I missed, let me know in the comments. I'm curious to see what people think, especially in regard to the questions I had about Little Hope's ending, because, I'm interested in hearing what someone who maybe can make sense of it thinks, just for fun. I don't think there's any way to actually make sense of it, but I'd like to hear how people try at the very least. Anyway, that should about do it. So yeah, thanks again, and see ya.